Today our discussion is going to be on literary genres, with a quick guide to going to the library prepared. If you're taking guided notes with this lesson, look for words and sentences that are highlighted, bold, and underlined. These will generally be what the teacher wants you to go over. The library. At our school, we go to the library once every 2 weeks, and while we're there, I often notice a lot of students having trouble picking out a book and deciding what they want to read. I feel like a lot of students don't completely understand genre, subgenres, and what exactly that means. In this discussion, we're going to talk about what each of those are and how that can help you find a book when you're going to the library. So you're in the library. There's a very set amount of time that you have to check out a book. There's probably a whole lot of other students reaching and grabbing books. There's a librarian waiting for you to come up to the counter and check something out. You're completely overwhelmed and stressed out, and then your time's up. Hopefully with this, you'll be able to come up with what books will actually be things that interest you. And genre can help you get there. Genre is kind of a catch-all term, and it doesn't always just apply to books. Genre means a style or type, and there can be a wide variety of different types of things. The word applies to other media like music, like movies, like TV shows. Genre is something that you'll see a whole lot, and for each type of media, usually there's different terms encapsulating what that show or what that book is actually about or what's in it. Really good example to look at to start out is music, because everybody listens to music. Maybe you like pop music the best, or maybe you like rock music, or maybe something else. A lot of the times, these genres are not 100% specific to what that music actually will be, but you still get a general idea of what it's going to be like. If you listen to electronic music, there's going to be electronic instruments used to play the music. However, like I said, sometimes genres aren't 100% perfect, as you can see with our last example here. Some people might consider that to be country. Some people might consider it to be rap. Some people might consider it to be something else. In fact, when I looked it up, Billboard had the song and album for Old Town Road on their rap charts. However, I've heard a lot of students refer to it as a country song. And I saw it on another chart for pop. It's kind of difficult to perfectly classify it, but with a lot of types of music, you can fit it into a general category that we call a genre of music. Now, sometimes we can divide it even further into subgenres. You like pop music, maybe you like K-pop music, or you like rock, and you like alternative rock or indie rock or something like that. A subgenre is a subcategory within a genre. And for a subgenre, it falls within a larger category. Let's look at movies. So movie genres, we have action, drama, romance, comedy. These are common terms you'll see associated with a movie. Say you look at the poster and it says it's the #1 action movie of the summer. That's great, but it doesn't tell you a whole lot. All it really tells you is that there will be some sort of action involved. A lot of the times it helps to break a movie down into subgenres. So if it's a superhero action movie, we know that there's going to be superheroes involved. Maybe there's Spider-Man and, he has to battle somebody. Or if it's a drama, maybe it's a historical drama and it's based on something that happened in the past. Again, with movies, we have that example of how genres are never perfect. Romance and comedy could be broken down into a romantic comedy. Sometimes they blend. Sometimes an action movie will also have comedy within it. Genres are to help us categorize things, but they're almost never perfect. And subgenres help to break it down so that it gets a little bit more specific. Now let's look at literary genres. A literary genre is a style, type, or category of literature, what we read. So now we're really getting to the meat of what we're discussing today. Literary genres fall into 4 major types: drama, fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. For the purposes of this discussion, we're going to mostly be focusing on fiction and nonfiction, as these will be what most students are checking out when they go to the library on a general weekly basis. So let's start with the basics. Fiction is imagined. It is created by an author. It's not real, or at least it's not completely real. Maybe it has some real aspects if it's based on history, but the characters are made up. The things that happen within it are made up. Ultimately, an author has had to use their imagination to come up with something to create a story that is fiction. Next up, we have nonfiction. These are stories that are not fake, they are factual. Going back for a second on that, nonfiction books are also going to have different subgenres involved, but they're a little bit easier to classify, I guess, than fiction can be. Just remember that if it's nonfiction, it's not fake, and it's generally going to be real or as close to real as the author could get. So you're presented with a whole lot of different books, again, when you go to the library. And when we see the covers of books, they can sometimes give us hints as to what genre it is. In the book in the top left corner, we have Aragon, which is a fantasy novel. And while I've actually not read the novel Aragon, I could probably get a guess as to what it's about based on the fact that it has a dragon on the front. We associate dragons a whole lot with fantasy. Some books, like the Percy Jackson series, may give us some ideas into it also being a sort of fantasy book with mythology involved, because we'll often see pictures of Greek mythology or Greek mythological figures and items on the front of it. Some books are a little bit more confusing. The Warriors series, for example, is really popular with middle school students, and I've always found the covers to be a little bit not clear as to what exactly it is. Usually there's just a realistic picture of a cat on the front, sometimes something else, but it's kind of hard to tell what it's actually about based on the fact that there's just cats on the front cover. And a lot of students, luckily, have checked out the book flap and read about it and gotten into it and really enjoyed it, but I feel like the cover doesn't do a whole lot. Maybe the title tells you that it's going to be about battle and war and things like that, but the cover's not perfect. I agree also that the cover for the Hunger Games, while it looks cool and has a picture that ties into the book pretty well, doesn't really give you a whole lot of indication as to what that book is about. You are going to have to check out the covers, behind the covers, and read the inserts to figure out what some books are actually about or what genre or subgenre they fall in before you check them out. Another book, nonfiction books are usually a little bit more easy to choose what they are. They'll have, for example, if they're an autobiography, they might have the person who wrote it on the front, and they might have a quote from the book or who the book is about. Usually with nonfiction, you can kind of tell that, hey, this is a book about Malala, or hey, this is a book about the Titanic. They usually make it pretty clear. Now, literary subgenres. This is where we begin to break it down a little bit further. So, for example, our action movie, where we brought it down and said that it was a superhero action movie. This is where we break it down. We take fiction and we say, okay, this is a fiction novel and it's fantasy, or it's fiction and we break it down further and say that it's science fiction. These different subgenres are going to be probably the most important part of this discussion that we're having. You want to know what the different types are, at least a little bit, so that if a book says, hey, this is a fantasy novel, you have an idea of what might be in it. The different literary subgenres are fantasy, realistic fiction, folklore, science fiction, mystery, historical fiction, and romance. And there's even more subgenres than that, but I felt like this was a pretty good list to start off with. Let's look at some examples of some of those. And there's a few notes to go along with each of these, just the most basic things you need to know about each subgenre. Realistic fiction is a good place to start because it's fiction, but it could happen in real life. The story Hatchet is about a boy who crash lands in the Canadian wilderness and has to survive on his own. That's the type of thing that's actually happened to people before. Luckily, not many people, but it's an interesting story because it is this insane thing that happens to a normal person. The same can be said for The Crossover. It's a realistic story. It could happen in real life. Fantasy is a story in a made-up world or a world like ours, but different. For example, Harry Potter is definitely a fantasy novel. There's people using magic, but it happens in a world that's like ours in a whole lot of ways. There's locations just like ours in the real world, but different. Fantasy can be very, very different. It can be set on a different planet entirely, but sometimes they'll share characteristics with our world and just add things to it, like magic or dragons or something like that. Next up, we have science fiction. Now, this usually happens in the future, and it focuses on technology a lot of the time. Sometimes it will question, what would our world be like if there were cyborgs in it? There were robots doing the tasks of most people, or doing the jobs of most people. Popular novel currently would be Wrinkle in Time, would be an example of science fiction to some extent. Remember that they usually happen in the future, but not always. Sometimes it could be, people in our world going to space or something like that. Typically, you have something futuristic within it, and there is some kind of focus on technology that maybe we don't currently have. Following that would be mystery. Mystery is something that must be solved. Example, a crime has happened and somebody must clear their name or face a life in prison. Or maybe it's a treasure hunt. Maybe someone has buried a fortune and people team up to try to find it before another team does. A couple examples posted here. The Westing game is a really good one that I've read with my class before. It is a mystery. There is someone dead, and that person has left behind a fortune for people to discover. Mystery, of course, can be an element in many of the other subgenres that we've discussed. You could have a science fiction story that has an element of mystery in it. We talked about Harry Potter being a fantasy book, but almost every single one of the Harry Potter novels has some sort of overarching mystery that the characters must solve before the novel is over. Still, some novels are more dedicated mysteries, as in they'll generally have a mystery that takes up almost the entire focus of what's going on. Another subgenre we mentioned slightly before was historical fiction. It's fiction and it's fake, but it's based on real history. So, for example, maybe the novel happens during World War II and it shares locations that were important in World War II, and there's real people from World War II in the book. But maybe the main characters are characters that are made up, or maybe they're even real people, but we don't know exactly what they did, so they had to make up what happened for most of the story. This one's a little bit confusing, but generally keep in mind that it has to do with history in some way. So if you like history, this could be a genre for you, but it's not going to be 100% accurate. There's going to be made up elements. Now, so we don't have to go over subgenres forever, let's take a look at a couple more really quick. We have romance stories, and of course this is a love story, and it's also an element that's common as part of other genres. You'll find romance in mysteries and fantasy novels and sci-fi. Another subgenre we have is folklore, and this one we might break down in a further discussion another day, but this has to do with things like tall tales, myths, legends, fables. They fall into folklore. Just know that folklore is typically based on stories that have been around a long, long time. Folklore stories may have been around before your grandparents were around. They may be hundreds of years old. They may be legends from thousands of years ago, but they've existed and transformed and continued on to be popular today, and often are adapted to appeal to modern people. Next, we briefly want to look at the subgenres of nonfiction. So with nonfiction, again, it's real. We have biographies in nonfiction. These are the stories of someone's life written by another person. Example, let's say I decided to write a book about George Washington. I could look up tons of information about George Washington. I could dig deep into his past, but I'm never really going to be able to get into the mind of George Washington. It's not going to happen. So that book is going to be a biography because I wrote it. Let's say that George Washington sat down and wrote a book about George Washington. That would be an autobiography. This is the story of a person's life written by that person. Next, we have a narrative, and this is a story about something that happened in real life. Maybe later on in the school year, you might write a personal narrative, a personal story from your life about something that happened. That would fall under nonfiction if you kept it completely true. That's something that happened in the real world and would be an example of nonfiction. Again, keep in mind that most genres connect to each other. Genre is rarely a perfect definition. It's just something used to help us as readers, as moviegoers, as music listeners, to try to classify things and find other examples of what we like. It's not rocket science, but it is a little bit complicated whenever you're trying to dig deep down into, subgenres and things like that. Now, as we begin to wrap this up, let's look at using genre to help you. Think of a book you read and enjoyed, then try to place it within a genre or a subgenre. What genre do you think the book falls within? Take a second and think about that. And then once you become familiar with different genres and subgenres, it will be easier to find books that you may enjoy. Let's say that I read one science fiction book, and I'm going to say that The Hunger Games is science fiction, even though it has a whole lot of other elements within it. I liked The Hunger Games, so I realized that I like things that happen in the future. I like dystopian fiction, which is an even further down category for often science fiction subgenre books. And using that information, I am able to find other books like The Hunger Games, and suddenly I find 10 other series that I really enjoy, and I can explore that whole subgenre. Or if you want to make it even easier than that, you can go to Google and type in books like The Hunger Games. And I did it a few minutes before making this presentation, and I did it for the book Wonder, and I had 14 different lists come up, like tons and tons of different lists came up on the homepage. And I could click one, and most of them were generally pretty high quality. In fact, Google put in a whole bunch of other books like Wonder at the very top of the page that I could just scroll through. And yes, those books aren't always going to be perfectly matched. I may like Wonder, but I may not like this other book that Google says was like Wonder. But if I take it a step further and read other people's reviews of that book and hopefully avoid spoilers in that process, I can often find books without too much trouble before I even go to the library. The library is way less stressful if you go to it with a book already in mind. Worst case scenario, that book's not there and you ask the librarian to hold it for the next time that you come. Okay, so we went pretty quickly through that. If you need to stop the video here and rewind it to any part to complete any part of your guide and notes, you're welcome to. Thank you, and have an excellent day.